Oh, I lost my mom to suicide.
Okay, no way. You cannot use that to get the cute guy and the last blueberry muffin.
Did I use that already today? I'm sorry.
Okay.
Have you noticed that it sometimes seems like everyone wants to be the victim, at least today? Major groups of people, be they Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement, are based fundamentally on claims of victimization, of being mistreated by other groups or individuals. As recent times have shown, when people are convinced that their group has been victimized, the resulting behavior can be explosive, to put it mildly.
Some people do tend to say that they are technically or basically, the IRA.
So that's why I voted for them, Kathleen!
While we have seen evidence of group victimization and victimhood on a massive scale erupt in the form of Black Lives Matter, we've also seen it in a plethora of individuals. Many classic Karen freakouts erupt from a sense of victimization, be that because someone told Karen to wear a mask or because any seeming slight against her results in your typical Karen meltdown. We've also recently seen high-profile cases of individual victimization as well, as in the cases of AH and ex-husband Johnny Depp, wherein Amber's claims of mistreatment, which have received massive mainstream media attention, likely have permanently damaged the career of a once-beloved star, regardless of said claims' veracity, as the evidence seems to show that if mistreatment happened at all in that relationship, it was at least mutual. Another highly public lawsuit, the case of voice actor Vic Mignogna, has illustrated the destruction that claims of victimhood can have on someone's career, with Vic being blacklisted from any previous jobs in a small and highly competitive industry, all due to claims of bad behavior. Everyone seemingly wants to be the victim, and why not when it clearly garners not only attention, but overwhelming support from many people who have been taught to believe without questioning. Thus we end up with everything from burning cities to burning careers, ended all because there's real value in being the victim. So much so that people will actually compete over who is the most oppressed. So today, let's look into victim mentality. Who is a victim and why does it pay to play that role? As well as the benefits and costs of playing it. Because today's video is a bit of a spicy meatball, it's sponsored by a service that allows you to search for spicy things online without worrying about your browsing privacy. That's Surfshark VPN. Surfshark allows you to easily and quickly connect to servers around the globe, both through their application and a handy browser extension, so your internet browsing is safe, secure, and most of all private. Surfshark includes a true incognito mode in their blind search function, so your searches display only pure organic results, allowing you to surf the web with no ads, no logs, and no trackers. Surfshark's unique HackLock feature will also tell you anytime your email address or passwords have been leaked online, so you can take preventative measures to protect your personal data. In addition to keeping your searches and accounts safe, Surfshark allows you to change your IP address so you can access content not available in your region. If you're in the US, you can't catch classic British sci-fi like Red Dwarf or Doctor Who, and although I'd avoid those later seasons, just a click of the button and you'll have access. If you're not in the US, great American TV comedies like Parks and Recreation or 30 Rock are unavailable. But if you want to go to there, access is just a click away. If you check the link in my description and use the code AYDIN, that's AYDIN, you'll get 85% off a 2-year plan with Surfshark, plus 3 months of extra service absolutely free with a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can try it out absolutely free, and if you find the service isn't for you, and I just think it might be, no hassle. So click the link below to check out Surfshark VPN to open up a world of content without using competing sites and services. And speaking of competition, let's talk about competitive victimhood. When people feel that they are victims, they may behave differently than if they don't perceive themselves under that label. We are often asked to believe victims no matter what their claims may be, but is there something about the mentality of victims that would give us pause to reasonably question the accuracy of their claims? Is there anything about victimization specifically that raises red flags? I think when we look to research on competitive victimhood, we might find some answers. Competitive victimhood refers to a group's motivation and consequent efforts to establish that it has suffered more than other groups, specifically adversarial groups to which one is at odds. The problem is that no one, well, most people, don't see themselves as the villain of their own story, but rather often as the victims. Of course, this becomes a problem when everyone sees themselves as a victim because someone always has to be the aggressor for there to be a victim. Thus, victims compete with one another for the right to be the most victimized.
Are we the baddies?
Victimhood can take several forms, including physical, material, cultural, psychological, or by emphasizing the illegitimacy of harm. In his discussion of this tendency, Vulcan 1997 describes negotiation between Arab and Israeli leaders thusly: "They began by reciting past injuries, as if competing to see who had suffered more. In this way, people end up competing over who is the real victim." Sullivan et al. 2012 examined competitive victimhood across 5 experiments, wherein competitive victimhood arose in response to accusations of harm, which is particularly of import to us when assessing the victim mentality when it comes to claims of Me Too misconduct. The first study assessed this between the sexes, having male participants read a description of a woman as being self-victimized, that is, that the differences between men and women in the workplace are due to women's own decisions and life choices, a description of women as being victimized by men, wherein men were blamed for inequality, or they read that men and women were treated equally in the workplace. Men who had been exposed to the prompt that described women as the victims of men's behavior experienced more feelings of competitive victimhood. That is, when men were given information that claimed men were responsible for discrimination, those men were more likely to feel that they had been victimized too. A second study examined competitive victimhood in the context of the university. This time, students read that university professors were treated poorly by students or by university administrators. Student respondents reported more competitive victimhood in response to claims that other students mistreated teachers, agreeing with statements that depicted students as being discriminated against at the university. These data illustrate that across various subjects, people don't like hearing that others are victimized by their in-group, as perhaps it implies guilt at an individual level, and that in response to claims of victimization from one's in-group towards others, that in-group will feel that they are the real victims. A third study returned to the subject of gender and replicating the first, this time having female participants read about men discriminating against other men in the workplace, preferring to hire women, or a description of women as being sexist against men, stating that 95% of women hold some sexist beliefs about men, and that 65% said they would actively discriminate against men when given an opportunity to. Political orientation was also assessed. Women who were exposed to a portrayal of men as victimized by women engaged in more competitive victimhood than women exposed to a portrayal of men as victimized by other men. Additionally, more liberal women experienced greater degrees of competitive victimhood than did women of other self-reported political orientations. I know it's probably not a huge surprise that liberal women are more likely to see themselves as victims, considering they so often claim to be victims, but hey, you always have to show these things with data, or else it's just conjecture. So now you can say with confidence, and more importantly with evidence, that yes, liberal women are more likely to see themselves as victims. When you look at the Me Too movement, again, that's not a huge surprise that some people within it are just competitive victims, similar to how Karens often seem to compete for their own victim status. A fourth study looked at perceptions of racially based preference for white students in US universities, giving students a prompt that either stated that black people received less frequent college acceptances than did Asians, or that white students were given preferential treatment over black students. This study sought to examine stigma reversal. Stigma reversal refers to the idea that when previously stigmatized groups become equal within society, members of the group responsible for their oppression may themselves be, or at least feel, stigmatized because of their association with a group now seen as culpable. Thus, white people might experience stigma reversal when people shout that all lives don't matter, for example. For, as we all know, no lives matter. White students experienced both stigma reversal and competitive victimhood when they read about black students not being chosen for the same positions as white students. They instead viewed themselves as being discriminated against by the university process. Of course, universities do discriminate, as research from Eppenshade and Radford 2009 found that being Asian decreased one's likelihood of being admitted into an elite university by 67%. But for white students, thinking that another group was discriminated against in admissions caused them to believe that they were the ones being really discriminated against. A fifth study examined age and the potential for it to also lead to competitive victimhood. Young adults, aged 17 to 25, either read that young people have an advantage over the elderly when it comes to jobs and positions of authority, or that older people were preferred in the workplace. Those who read that young people had an advantage were less likely to experience stigma reversal and a sense of collective guilt. That is, when young people were told that they were given preferential treatment due to their age, they experienced more strong feelings of being a victim and felt less guilt for the plights of the elderly. Everyone wants, it seems, to be a victim, no matter who actually has power in a given scenario. The moment another person is seen as suffering some hardship due to the actions of a group one identifies with, there is a yearning to rationalize that the self is also being mistreated. Not only can competitive victimhood make all groups of people see themselves as victims, particularly when that victim status brings some social desirability, it can also lead to fundamentalism, as research from Mashuri et al. 2015 indicated in their analysis of Muslims and competitive victimhood, as well as globalization threat. Globalization threat is measured by two types of threat: individual and realistic. Individual globalization threat involves items such as, I am very concerned about the values and cultures of globalization that are not in line with Muslim ways of life. While realistic globalization threat includes items such as, I fear that globalization will weaken the economy of the Islamic world in interstate competition. They found that identity globalization threat, but not realistic globalization threat, mediated the connection between competitive victimhood and religious fundamentalism. That is, when Muslims felt like their group was victimized compared to other groups, and when they also felt that globalization was negatively affecting their way of life as part of their personal and religious identity, the more likely they were to engage in religious fundamentalism. In an additional study, again, competitive victimhood led to an increase in religious fundamentalism. Those who were high in identity globalization threat and viewed their Muslim identity as highly entitative, seeing themselves as similar to other Muslims, were the highest in religious fundamentalism. That is, people who are competitive victims may lean towards fundamentalist ideas, but only when they see themselves as typical of their group. When it comes to claims of bad behavior about men or from white people, women or black people may therefore be more likely to believe in extremist feminist or race-based ideologies when he or she also believes they fit in well with the aggrieved group. Moreover, those who tend to see themselves as victims may also just agree with more extremist political or social views. And if you doubt this is the case, may I direct you to the consequences of the Treaty of Versailles. Similarly, Bilowitz and Stefaniak, 2013, examined competitive victimhood and beliefs in anti-Semitic views in Polish participants. Items assessed were belief in absolute victimhood of the Polish people, as well as relative victimhood in relation to other groups. These were compared to Polish participants' belief in the power of Jews, as well as more negative attitudes towards Jews. Both forms of victimhood were related to both types of beliefs about Jewish people. Further, when placed into a regression analysis used to predict impact, both forms of victimhood predicted both forms of discriminatory beliefs. A second study included identification with one's in-group, in this case Polish, with beliefs in a Jewish conspiracy, and found that competitive victimhood mediated this relationship. That is, when people identify strongly with a group, say BLM, then they may be more likely to experience competitive victimhood in relationship to other groups and subsequently believe negative things about any outgroup. When applied to Me Too, these findings could extend to believing myths about men that many feminists hold in relation to feelings of competitive victimhood, and this could explain the negative reaction from BLM advocates to All Lives Matter, as these groups are seen as competing for attention, hence why some BLM supporters seem to have an issue with certain group of people. The role of power has also been assessed in relationship to competitive victimhood in research from Kahalan et al. 2019. In addition to power, need for morality was also measured, which is the need to defend one's in-group identity by claiming the innocent victim status. In a first study, researchers examined these relationships in Israeli citizens, who were either Jewish or Arabic, always the best of pals when it comes to intergroup conflict. They found that in Arab participants, competitive victimhood was more strongly correlated with the need for morality, for innocent victim status, than it was in the Jewish Israeli sample. In Jewish participants, competitive victimhood was positively correlated with the defensive need for moral reputation, and negatively correlated with the need for positive moral essence, which is core moralistic values. A second study looked at these variables in men and women, and found that women were higher in a need for power and a need for morality, seeing themselves as innocent victims. In summation, women tend to be more prone to competitive victimhood than are men, and this comes from a greater need for power and a desire to be seen as morally righteous. The implications for the Me Too movement here should be obvious. Women who want power and to be seen as morally superior to others, more so than men, are likely to engage in competitive victimhood. As we've seen, competitive victimhood may not only play a role in interpersonal behavior or beliefs, but particularly in intergroup interaction, as outgroups serve as a comparison against which one engages in competitive victimhood. Shori Eol Halperin and Bartal, 2014, examined intergroup competitive victimhood in the context of Jewish and Palestinian intergroup interactions. In their first experiment, Israeli participants were asked about their collective victimhood, the historical victimhood of the Jewish people, and their willingness to engage in compromise with Palestinians. Those who felt that Jewish people were victimized, historically or currently, were less willing to compromise with the Palestinians. A second study was conducted in 2 waves, one during peace talks between Israel and Palestine in 2007, and then shortly after civilian attacks on Israelis began in late 2008, leading to a wide-scale offensive that resulted in 1,300 Palestinian casualties and 13 Jewish casualties. During the operation in the Gaza Strip, respondents exhibited high levels of collective victimhood related to the specific escalation, and were fairly supportive of aggressive military actions against Palestinians. The more people perceived Israel as a victim and denied Palestinian victimhood, the more they supported extreme military action. Thus, the more people see themselves as victims, the more justified they see extreme action, as the civil unrest of 2020 so thoroughly evidences. Competitive victimhood can then lead to some extreme outcomes, such as support for military action against the group competing for victim status then. De Guisme and Licata 2016 examined how competitive victimhood can also lead to negative behaviors or beliefs about the group one is competing with to be the bigger victim. A first study examined sub-Saharan immigrants to Belgium and found that those who viewed their group as victims had negative attitudes towards both Jewish people and Belgians. Anti-Semitism was related to competitive victimhood, with sub-Saharans feeling that they had to vie for attention with Jews, such that competition over recognition was related both to competitive victimhood and to anti-Semitism. Competition for recognition was directly responsible for anti-Semitic attitudes compared to competitive victimization though, indicating that in some instances, it's not about being the victim, it's about just being recognized at all. It's just often the case that recognition takes shape as victimization.
You were hurt! You were the victim!
I'm glad you understand.
A second study examined Muslim immigrants to Belgium and found similar results. Anti-Semitism was correlated with collective victimhood, lack of recognition, competitive victimhood, and competition over recognition. A third study in this set moved away from the heavier real-world examples and instead looked at competitive victimhood between university students. Psychology majors read that 3 years ago, business students had hacked into the school's computers and changed the final exam grades for psychology and law students to failing grades in an anthropology course required for business, law, and psychology. The students then read that the school had formally apologized to one or both of the majors and allowed one or both to retake the exam, or that the school had issued no such apology and forced both to retake the entire course. Participants had more negative opinions towards the perpetrator business students when unequal treatment was given both to their own major and students from the other major. They also expressed less positive attitudes towards school authorities when the school had recognized one major as the victim, but not the other. This illustrates that when two groups see each other as relatively similar to one another and both victims of the same suffering, members of a group that is recognized will feel negatively if the other group is not recognized as well. This may explain why there is some infighting over who is the highest on the progressive stack, women, black people, trans people, etc., but so long as there is a common enemy, say white men, then competitive victimhood doesn't become center stage, and instead, one group may be incensed that another they see as suffering along with them is being disrespected. Thus, when people feel that they are victims together, they may not be as likely to compete for resources as when they see them as competing for victimhood. Coors et al. 2015 examined inclusive and competitive victimhood in the context of the conflict between Ireland and North Ireland.
All this drinking, violence, destruction of property, are these the things we think of when we think of the Irish?
Inclusive victimhood is the perception of similarity between various groups of victims. When combined with low levels of competitive victimhood, inclusive victimhood predicted support for social reconstruction and forgiveness. Conversely, when combined with high levels of competitive victimhood, inclusive victimhood did not predict support for reconstruction or forgiveness. Thus, when there is some competitive victimhood, but also a perception that there is an outgroup that has suffered from the same conflict, then forgiveness is more possible between otherwise conflicting groups of self-identified victims. A second study replicated the first and found that inclusive victimhood did not necessarily lead to intergroup reconciliation. In contrast, inclusive victimhood was positively related to competitive victimhood when that inclusivity referred to another group worldwide that had suffered because of the same specific causes as one's own community. As such, while victimhood may be competitive, it can also cause groups to feel a sense of kinship in reaction to perceptions of mutual suffering. Halabi, Schnabel, and Noor 2013 found similar results in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In their first study, Palestinian and Jewish residents of Israel read a vignette that described a recent archaeological find which traced both Jewish and Palestinian people to a primordial ancestor culture, emphasizing a shared history, or a vignette that focused on mutual group suffering. Reading that recent research suggested that both groups were victims of the prolonged conflict as they have both experienced substantial individual and national losses of human life, property, trust, and hope, representing a common victim identity. They found that the common victim identity reduced competitive victimhood and led to increased forgiveness. A second study replicated the first and found that both a common victim identity and a common perpetrator identity, in which both Israel and Palestine were described as having inflicted great harm on one another, were both related to decreased competitive victimhood. When two groups then get to equally play the victim, or even think that both groups have done wrong to one another, competitive victimhood is weakened in favor of inclusive victimhood, because everyone kind of likes to be the victim. Thus, Me Too and BLM can get along well as long as their victim status is being equally shared. Conversely, rather than agreeing to both be victims, intergroup conflict may be ameliorated when one group believes that they have won the status of the true victim, as seen in Samantha Naccielli, Schnabel, and Halabi 2015, in their assessment of Jewish-Palestinian intergroup animosity. Researchers told Jewish and Palestinian residents of Israel that research indicated either group had been found definitively to have suffered more than the other, essentially winning the right to be the victim. Believing that one's group had won victim status increased willingness to forgive and perceptions of group efficacy, while reducing pessimistic views of the conflict, making people feel perhaps as if said conflict had been worth it to claim one's own group as the true victim. However, feeling one's group were the real victims decreased propensity to act towards resolution, meaning that while groups may believe they have claimed victimhood over another group, they are less willing to work on intergroup relationships, but are a little bit more willing to forgive. So long as the in-group gets to stay the victim, reconciliation then is more possible. And now that we understand competitive victimhood, let's look further into the idiosyncrasies and tendencies that accompany the mentality of victimhood. As we've covered what competitive victimhood is and how it functions, both in making groups compete with one another for resources and how it can be ameliorated, let's look at other facets of the mentality of victimhood. A basic cognitive process that may motivate groups to engage in collective victimhood is moral typecasting. Moral typecasting refers to the tendency to classify moral actors into mutually exclusive roles of agents, i.e. those who have the capacity to do right or wrong, and patients, i.e. those who are passive targets of right or wrong acts. Gray and Wegner, 2009, examined this hypothesis of moral typecasting across 7 experiments, so we've got another long one here with a lot of information. In the first study, participants read that Sam pushed a tray of glasses off the table, causing them to shatter and injure Roger, and were asked to assess how responsible Sam was and how much pain Roger was in. The only difference between the two conditions is that the ages of the characters changed, describing one or both as either adults or children. Sam was seen as less responsible for the act if he was a child, and Roger in much more pain when he also was a child. A second section of this study similarly looked at the tendency to view adults with a mental disability as low in agency. This time, Matthew was described as an adult with a cognitive disability, while Chris was an adult of average intelligence. Both were described as engaging in bad actions, killing a man or stealing a painting, or good actions, defusing a bomb or rescuing some hostages. Don't ask me how Matthew was supposed to defuse the bomb, sounds like a challenge for the upper class Twit of the Year show.
And now they've got to take the bras off from the front. This is really difficult.
They found that Matthew was seen as having less agency, meaning he was less worthy of blame for his bad actions, but also less worthy of praise for his good ones than was Chris. Similarly to the first study, Matthew was seen as experiencing both more pain and pleasure as a result of his actions. Thus, much like children, adults who are seen as disabled are also seen as more vulnerable emotionally and less culpable for their actions. With this in mind, it's no wonder why groups like Me Too or BLM downplay the individual agency of purported victims. It allows them to avoid accountability. The second study in this set I have to talk about, if for no other reason than because it produced this graph that places MLK and Mother Teresa next to Hitler and Osama bin Laden. Who's the villain? The answer might This study asked participants about several different figures or types of people and asked them to rate how much blame or praise that person deserved for actions in their life, as well as how much pain that person might be in were he or she to step on a piece of broken glass. Participants felt that orphans had little control over their actions, but also were likely to experience extreme pain. In contrast, figures like MLK, but also Hitler, were seen as being highly agentic, having a degree of control over their actions, and thus praiseworthiness or blameworthiness respectively was high, while the amount of pain they were reported to feel was comparatively low. People who are seen as victims, then, are seen as in less pain when they are also seen as agentic. This illustrates that people tend to think of victims as having little control over their lives and being in great pain, similarly to how one would see a child or a mentally disabled person. A third study involved 3 experiments rating how agentic and how much pain was felt either by Michael or Jeffrey, 2 average men in different scenarios. The first described Michael as genetically sensitive to pain, and participants subsequently rated him as more likely to enjoy a massage than Jeffrey, who was not genetically sensitive. In a second experiment, Jeffrey took a stand against the CEO of his company for deciding to scrap the company's green policies by walking out on a meeting. Michael then followed.
Oh my god, you guys, look, it's Recyclops!
Recyclops destroy!
When the two were subsequently described as having scalding hot coffee poured on them, respondents reported that Jeffrey, the one who first took the stand against the CEO, as a relative moral patient experiencing more pain. A third experiment in this set described Jeffrey as being responsible for firing another employee, while Michael simply agreed. This time Jeffrey was seen as more morally agentic, and therefore experienced less pain than Michael when coffee was spilled on him. Looking to even more minor differences in behavior that can change perceptions of moral agency or patiency, and thus subsequent reports of pain, were 2 experiments in a fourth set. In the first, Jeffrey booked a flight and asked Michael to join him. Both were described as falling and scraping their hands on a sidewalk. This small act of booking a flight made Jeffrey seem more agentic, and thus Michael was reported as being in more pain as a result of falling on the pavement. In a second experiment in this set, Michael was described as a CEO who worked his way up through determination and hard work, while Jeffrey was a psychopath who worked in a nursing home and liked to abuse animals and people. Participants were then asked which man was more likely to die at the hands of a murderer who was on the loose in their area. Participants viewed Michael as more agentic, but also as more likely to be the target of a murderer. Thus, it's not just moral patients who are more likely to be rated as feeling greater pain. That person must also be seen as a relative moral person for people to attribute suffering to them, seeing the world as a place where bad things don't happen to bad people. Belief in a just world is a trait that's held by many people, but here it seems that moral typecasting is related to belief in kind of an unjust world. In a fifth study, Jeffrey was said to have placed a vial of Coke, not the soda kind, in Michael's desk, resulting in Michael being fired from his job, again representing relative good moral patiency and relative evil moral agency. They then read that either Michael or Jeffrey shortchanged a waitress and later fell and scraped his hands. Michael was seen as less agentic than Jeffrey, but was also seen as being less to blame for underpaying the waitress and in more pain from scraping his hands. This means that people who are believed to be victims are just seen as less capable of doing wrong in the future, in addition to being more delicate. Victimhood extends its umbrella of protection, such that when one is perceived of as a victim, that person is seen as being unlikely to intentionally cause harm. A sixth study compared David, a high school teacher, to Alex, who was either described as an employee of the Red Cross, who in his spare time is a pilot who likes to deliver supplies to doctors in conflict zones, so, a real scumbag, or as a child whose parents died in a car crash and lives with his elderly and infirm grandmother, so an agent and patient, respectively. Participants were then asked how much torture they thought each person could endure. When compared to child Michael, David was seen as less agentic, but more agentic when paired with Michael the Red Cross pilot. David was seen as experiencing more pain than was pilot Michael, but less pain than child Michael. As such, these data are illustrative that victimhood is always relative. An average person may seem like more of a victim in comparison to a heroic figure, while that person seems like less of a victim when compared to someone with less agency. To ensure one is always seen as a victim then, one should exaggerate the extent of their ongoing suffering, as we know some people are wont to do. The final study in this set described a drug to participants that either caused intense pain or pleasure. Participants were asked to divide up 3 pain or pleasure pills among the following people: 2 good moral agents, the Dalai Lama and Mother Teresa, 2 neutral agents, a high school teacher and a radiology technician, 2 patients, an orphan and a date violation victim, and 1 bad agent, serial killer Ted Bundy. Those who were seen as moral agents, such as Ted Bundy and the Dalai Lama, were given more pain pills than patients or neutral targets. While the immoral agents received the most pain pills, good agents received the second most pain pills. The researchers note one participant assigning pain pills to the Dalai Lama because he had been through suffering before, and thus the participant believed that he could take further suffering. These various experiments show fairly definitively, across various contexts, that people tend to go easy on those that they believe are victims or moral patients, while those with more agency are seen as being more capable of withstanding pain. This not only means that sometimes good people will be assigned to suffer just because they're more agentic, but that people tend to be very protective of those that they think are victims. For all of the talk of victim blaming that we hear, the research shows kind of the opposite is the case. People do not tend to blame victims and treat them more harshly for their claims. They instead view victims as less able to control their lives and therefore more deserving of sympathy. Another phenomenon that is likely to contribute to competitive victimhood is the magnitude gap, which is the disparity between victims' and perpetrators' perceptions of the severity of a transgression, as assessed by Kearns and Fincham 2005. In their first study, they asked participants to either think about a time when someone other than a romantic partner had hurt them or when they had wronged another. When writing as the perpetrators of harm, participants often portrayed their actions as caused by mitigating circumstances, and wrote that their behavior was justified. However, they were also more likely than victims to mention regret for the incident and blamed themselves often for what happened. A second study assessed romantic relationships and found similar results. For perpetrators compared to victims, more wrote that their behavior was justified and described their behavior as impulsive. Perpetrators were also more likely to deny that there were any negative consequences due to the event, and implied that victims' responses to the event were an overreaction. Thus, perpetrators are more likely to excuse their behavior or think that victims are blowing things out of proportion. Victims, on the other hand, tend to be kind of unforgiving, attributing little to extenuating circumstances. Thus, the same events can be seen as more severe from the perspective of victims and less severe from the perspective of perpetrators. We can see then how perception plays a role in how victims tend to see the world, and further data from Sadra and Ross 2007 provides supporting evidence. Their first study looked at memories of victimization events in Hindu and Sikh participants, who were asked to recall instances of violence committed by Sikhs against Hindus and vice versa. They then read short descriptions of various events wherein Hindus or Sikhs had attacked one another. 68% of the participants recalled at least one act of violence that victimized their in-group, compared to only 49% who recalled at least one in-group perpetrator event. On average, participants recalled a significantly greater number of episodes in which their in-group members were victims rather than perpetrators. Specifically, those who identified strongly as either Sikh or Hindu recalled fewer in-group harms than did those who did not strongly identify with their in-group. Relative to low identifiers, high identifiers reported thinking more frequently about in-group victim episodes. When the in-group was the perpetrator of a harmful act, high identifiers were more likely to believe that the victim group should forget about the event and move on with their lives, while the same high identifiers were also less willing to let go of their own memories about times when their group was the victim. A second study with Canadian participants asked them to think about a time when they felt very similar to others, representing a need to differentiate the self, or a time when they felt very dissimilar from others, representing a need for assimilation, or a time when they were similar to some but dissimilar from others, the control. They were then asked to think about a time when Canadians either harmed a group or helped a group. Generally, people recalled more positive memories about Canada than negative ones, but particularly when participants were asked to think of a time when they felt a need to fit into Canadian society rather than a need to differentiate themselves. Although people who felt a need for differentiation still recalled more positive memories than negative ones, the difference was most pronounced in participants who felt a need for similarity. This means people who want to differentiate themselves from others, special snowflakes if you will, may just be less prone to recall positive memories and more prone to recall episodes of negativity associated with their nation or culture.
I'm a vampire with a soul.
A vampire with a soul? Oh my god, how lame is that?
People who feel they are the victims of some wrongdoing may often seek restitution for the wrongs done to them, perceived or otherwise, and this can in turn lead to victims making other groups feel victimized as well. Sagoy et al. 2013 looked at how majority groups reacted to feelings of victimization. Their first study examined Native Italians' opinions on immigrants to the nation and assessed their feelings of victimization, such as thinking Native Italians were being accused of racism for no good reason. Astonishingly, making people feel as if they are the victims by, telling them that they're the baddies constantly has reactance-like effects. In their sample, feeling wronged was associated with stronger perceptions that the inequality between native Italians and immigrants was legitimate, and was accompanied by decreased intentions to partake in action to redress that inequality. Weirdly, yelling about how evil a group is doesn't engender love from that group, and only makes them feel as if they're the ones being victimized. Very similar effects were found in a sample of white American men and women in comparison to Latinos. Once again, feeling wronged predicted stronger perceptions of the inequality between white people and Latino people as legitimate, and with decreased intentions to partake in action to reduce said inequality. That is, when white people agreed that they were being wronged by other groups, as did 73% of the respondents in this sample, they were more likely to see the differences between themselves and Latinos as legitimate, and were less likely to support progressive politics.
It's called the knockout game, and eventually white people are going to get tired of playing it.
Interestingly, this was not affected by the degree to which participants identified with white Americans as part of their identity. A third experiment replicated the previous studies and found similar results in Jewish participants in comparison to Arabs, in that Jewish participants who felt wronged also felt that the inequalities between Jews and Arabs in Israel were legitimate, and were less likely to support changes in policies that would favor Arab citizens. These studies indicate that groups in relative positions of power, historical or ongoing, don't react well to feeling victimized just as no one else does. As such, victimizing those that you see as in positions of power, whether that's real or not, does nothing but contribute to a cycle of victimhood and only makes more victims, which doesn't make anything better. On the topic of the cycle of victimhood, the distorted lens through which people feel perpetual feelings of victimhood was assessed by Shorial, Clark, and Ben Ahmet, 2017, in a series of studies on perpetual victimhood orientation, or PIVO. The instrument used to measure PIVO includes items such as, the suffering we have been through cannot be compared to that of any other group, or a general feeling that other people dislike the in-group. In the first experiment, Israeli participants were shown the name of a nation and then asked to quickly decide if people from that nation hate or do not hate Israel. They found that perceptions of others with those with PIVO is particularly negative, categorizing more outgroups as hostile than those low in the measure. Those high in PIVO also had an increased response time when deciding if a group was hostile or not. In total, results indicated that PIVO moderately predicted the number of national groups categorized as hostile toward the in-group, as well as more rapid responses when deciding if a group was hateful. People who think that they are perpetual victims, then, see groups around them as particularly hateful, and thus the world around them as a pretty negative place. Further research in this set sought to analyze the effects of PIVO on attributions of the intent of outgroup members in ambiguous situations. Jewish participants in the second study read a short prompt about a Jewish hiker who got lost in the mountains and sees an Arab shepherd who he cries to for help. The man responds by shouting back and waving over another man. Participants were then asked if they thought the man was calling for help, a benevolent outcome, just calling for his sheep, a neutral outcome, or planning to attack the hiker, a hostile outcome. PIVO was related positively to hostile intentions attributed to the shepherd and negatively related to the neutral option where the man was calling to his flock. A second segment of the study introduced feelings of PIVO by having Jewish participants read several segments about acts of discrimination carried out against Jews over the course of history, and then, similarly to the previous experiment, prompted them with a story about a Jewish man accidentally lost in Palestinian territory when his car gets a flat tire. He asked the residents of a nearby house for help, and the participants read that 3 men exited the house, either see his predicament and want to help him, are unsure of what he wants, or actively want to harm him, and were asked to rate how likely they thought each outcome was. Participants who were primed to think about historical traumas of Jewish people and were high in PIVO were more likely to believe an outgroup would have hostile intentions rather than neutral or benevolent intentions. As such, people who are thinking about victimization tend to think that their group is also more prone to being victimized in an otherwise ambiguous situation. The final study in this set had 4 conditions: perpetual victimhood prime, general threat, group identity prime, or neutral prime. As in the previous study, perpetual victimhood was primed with a text about historical suffering of Jewish people. The general threat prime text included information about natural hazards in Israel such as earthquakes or venomous snakes. The group identity prime text included descriptions of natural landmarks in Israel, or a neutral text about the invention of the telephone. They then read a vignette about 2 Palestinians whose car crashes into a military roadblock, injuring an Israeli soldier. The passengers either rushed out of the car to help the soldier, exited the car and just stood beside it, or attacked other soldiers with their car. Participants who were exposed to descriptions of historical group persecution attributed more negative intentions to outgroup members in the neutral scenario than did participants in all other conditions. Once again, higher scores in perpetual victimhood orientation also predicted greater belief that the most likely outcome of the scenario was hostile rather than benevolent or neutral. We've seen now across a variety of circumstances, some people are just more prone to think of themselves as victims, and feeling as if one is a victim can have various effects, including falsely recalling instances of victimhood, and as a result, seeing the self as a perpetual victim. Further, it seems that feeling one is a victim can lead to a tendency to blame others and only beget more victims. So on that note, let's talk about victim blaming. When you hear the term victim blaming, you may automatically think of the type that often accompanies the R word that I can't say because YouTube wouldn't like it very much. So in order to have anything approaching a conversation about research around that word and the myths surrounding it, I'm going to use the term grappling. So get greased up, because this topic of grappling is more oily than a sweaty red Turkish man. Grappling myth acceptance is a propensity to believe that grappling occurs because a woman dresses like Armika or secretly wishes to be grappled by guys from Shadaloo. Unlike moral typecasting, this tendency is related to a belief in a just world, as seen in Hayes, Lorenz, and Bell 2013. It's difficult for a lot of us to imagine that someone would be grappled without somehow deserving it, because to think that it happens to innocent victims means that the world isn't a just place, but just a shitty place. Overall, grapple myth acceptance, and I'll stop somewhat being silly here and use its acronym, RMA, is typified by 4 types: blaming the victim, disbelieving the victim, exonerating the perpetrator, or alluding that only certain women are targeted. Hayes et al.'s research indicated that both belief in a just world and gender were related to RMA. Belief in a just world for the self was negatively related to believing myths, and indicates that when people feel a sense of safety and security in their worldview, it's superfluous for them to blame the victim. Looking at RMA, why do people so often not believe victims? Well, people who are high in RMA don't attribute as much guilt to perpetrators as those low in the measure. Specifically, Aisel and Boner, a great name for this research and get used to it, 2008, asked participants to weigh in on the guilt or innocence of a defendant accused of grappling based on the amount of irrelevant information provided about the case, such as what the person studies or where they live. High RMA participants generally perceived lower levels of guilt than did low RMA participants. But perhaps more importantly, this effect was particularly pronounced when a lot of irrelevant information had been provided. This means that people aren't necessarily unlikely to believe victims overall, but they may be less likely to believe victims the more inconsequential information is included in a report. Moreover, if people have a reason to believe that he or she may not have accurate information about the case, they may not trust their own judgments.
Mr. Krabs, I am so confused.
In an additional study, participants were shown a string of non-words and were then told that the strings had actually been sentences containing relevant case information. Additionally, they were told that psychological studies have shown that people are capable of processing information even if it was not consciously recognized. People who believed they had missed but somehow subconsciously obtained information about the case, doubting their own memories, were less likely to find the defendant in a grappling case guilty. If people have a good reason to doubt their own thinking, be that due to an overload of information or just reasonable doubt, they are unlikely to make hard decisions on determining guilt, which, so long as the rule of law is still innocent until proven guilty, is actually a good thing. But it also means that people will be unwilling to cast a guilty verdict unless they feel very confident in their wealth of information. Maybe this really is evidence of myth acceptance, but I would instead call it good old-fashioned American jurisprudence. The behavior of a victim can also affect whether or not people are prone to blame them for their mistreatment, as seen in data from Boner, I told you there were going to be a lot of boners in here, 2001, in an analysis of reactions to depictions of grappling in media. German participants watched 2 clips, one from a soap opera titled Die Schwarzwald Clinic, or Black Forest Hospital, wherein an inconspicuously dressed woman is assaulted by 2 strange men, and the other from the film Accused, which features a woman in a short skirt flirting with a man in a bar until his, super combo meter maxes out and he grapples her. Participants then wrote a headline to describe what happened in the scene and answered questions about who was responsible. RMA was stronger when participants viewed the clip from Accused than Black Forest Hospital, and viewed the accused scene as less severe. The more passive voice used in participants' headlines, the higher those participants scored in RMA. This means that people tended to see grappling as something that happens rather than something that someone actively does. Interestingly, victims may themselves be prone to blame victims when they are a member of a social group that they view as adversarial, as seen in research from Warner, Wohl, and Branscombe, 2014. In their first study, Jewish participants were asked if victims are morally obligated to ensure that they never act towards others in a victimizing way. This assessed if Jewish people felt that lessons learned from World War II should encourage them to be empathetic towards other victimized groups, as well as questions that assessed their moral entitlement to do whatever is necessary to survive. They found that respondents felt a desire to help out other victimized groups and no entitlement to cause harm to others. In a second study, the outgroup that was suffering was specified as either people from Sudan, China, or Palestine, and suddenly opinions changed. Jewish people felt less obligated to help Palestinians than they did people from Sudan or China. Additionally, Jewish respondents reported more entitlement to defend their in-group at all costs, only when the target outgroup was Palestinians. An additional set of studies looked at the same propensity to be willing only to aid an outgroup when that outgroup is not adversarial, looking specifically at women. In their first experiment, women were asked questions measuring their moral obligations to help others, as well as questions that specifically asked women about their obligation to help African Americans, and questions about their moral entitlement, such as women deserve an extra break now and then. Female participants were also asked to write about historical oppression faced either by men or by women. They found women felt an obligation to help other suffering groups, and specifically help out African Americans. Women did not feel more entitled than other groups, and felt close to groups that they believed were oppressed. The female participants also thought that women could benefit from their history of oppression. The researchers' words, not mine. A second study instead asked female participants to write about the history of oppression of men or of women, with some reading that this discrimination was particularly prevalent in African Americans. This time, women felt unwilling to help African Americans when they were told that they held sexist beliefs. They also felt less similar to African Americans when they were told that they were sexist. That is, women's sense of moral obligation to African Americans decreased when African Americans were portrayed as adversarial to women. Additionally, when women believed that African Americans held sexist beliefs, their perceived similarity between victimization experiences of women and African Americans also decreased. Thus, people who perceive themselves as victims are unlikely to identify with other groups who are victimized when they also see that group of victims as adversarial. As such, victims will only be welcoming to other victims when they view that group as not being responsible for their own victimization. While people may be prone to give deference to victims, there is an anticipation that the descendants of victims should have learned something from that victimization and subsequently be better people, or more moral people, as seen in Branscombe et al. 2015 across a series of studies. In the first experiment, non-Jewish participants were asked to respond to a series of questions about Jewish people and Germans that included items such as, a central lesson from World War II is that Jewish or German people should assist weak and persecuted peoples around the world. Participants perceived Jews as having a greater moral obligation to not harm others when the lesson's focus was on Jewish victims rather than when the lesson's focus was on German perpetrators. A second study added in a third group to this equation, humans in general. I know that the wording of this sounds a bit sus, but don't think too hard about it.
The greatest enemies of mankind and worst barbarian race of all. Germans.
This time, participants were asked what values Jews or Germans or humans should hold today. If Jews or Germans or humans deserve any special rights because of World War II, if Jews or Germans or humans have any special obligations to others, and the implications of World War II for the way Jewish people, or Germans or humans, should relate to others today. Once again, Jewish moral obligations were highest in the Jewish-focused condition. A third study assessed benefit finding, which was measured in this experiment using questions like, because of their victimization history, Jewish people should become stronger, be kinder to others, appreciate their lives more, and be more ethical. Once again, participants endorsed Jewish moral obligations more when the target of the lesson was Jews rather than Germans, or the no lesson control condition. The fourth study in this set was more abstract, instead referring to just two groups as Group A and Group B, with Group B having committed grievous actions against Group A more than 50 years ago. Again, Group A was held to certain moral standards that were not applied to Group B. Participants believed the event should produce more benefit finding, agreeing that Group A should become stronger, be kinder to others, appreciate their lives more, and be more moral, and also that Group A should be held to greater moral obligations, such as taking care not to inflict suffering upon others. A fifth study provided participants with one of two groups, again unspecified, said to have experienced victimization in the past, or not having been victimized. This study found a history of victimization significantly predicted moral obligations, and significantly predicted benefit finding. Again, things like becoming stronger or being kinder in the future. A final study described country A as having a history that either involved great suffering or no suffering, and was then described as either attempting to help country B or engaging in aggressive policies against country B. Regardless of its background, when country A was said to be currently helping others, its citizens were seen as more moral. When country A had a victimized past, its citizens were seen as less moral when they were currently perpetuating harm, compared to when country A lacked a history of victimization. These data are all indicative that being a victim in the past does not allow one person or a group the moral right to behave badly in the future. While everyone may want to be the victim, victims are actually sometimes held to higher moral standards. Similarly, while people may expect victims to be virtuous, they may just as often repay victims with little but lip service, as seen in several experiments from Monin and Miller 2001, in their analysis of empty virtue signaling. In their first study, initially participants were asked if they agreed or disagreed with a supposedly sexist statement about women that was phrased as referring to most or all women. For example, some, or most women, are better off at home taking care of children. After reading the statements, participants were asked if a man or a woman would be a better fit to fill the job of foreman for a small manufacturing company in a highly competitive market. When participants had an opportunity to virtue signal in the previous section to a broad statement about most women, they were more likely to select a man as a better option for the foreman position. So long as one can show that they don't hold sexist beliefs, that person will somewhat ironically feel emboldened to make an arguably sexist decision. So long as one can virtue signal, that same person then feels able to make practical, if not politically correct, choices. The second study began by asking participants to select the best person for a job at a consulting firm. In the non-sexist credentials condition, the star applicant was a white woman. In the non-racist credentials condition, the star applicant was an African-American man. And in the no credentials condition, the applicant was a white man. These applicants were all assessed versus 4 white male applicants. After selecting someone for the consulting job, participants were told about a police officer position and that officers from the precinct had a history of making racist jokes. They were then asked whether a white man or a black man was better for the position of police officer. Once again, when given a previous opportunity to virtue signal by selecting a black man or a white woman for the job, participants were more likely to say that the job of cop was better suited for a white man than a black man. Interestingly, a third experiment found that this virtue signaling was not so much of importance to others as it was for an internal desire to see the self as not racist or sexist. This study replicated the second one, but after completing the initial task of selecting the best applicant for the consulting firm, another researcher entered the room and asked if there was enough time left for participants to take his survey about who to hire for the job of police officer. That way, participants thought different people would see their answers. Dang, I love when studies get clever like this. They found similar results to the second experiment, in that after having a choice to select a black man or a white woman, participants were then more likely to select a white man over a black man for the job of police officer, even when they thought different researchers were responsible for their data. Thus, virtue signaling is really more for personal benefit than it is solely as an attempt to show off to others. So long as one previously got a chance to choose a black person or a woman for the job, they were more willing to exclude a black person from the second job. I describe this as paying lip service because that's what it is. Empty, hollow, and of import only to the person doing it, more than it is genuinely concerned with the opinions of others. So now that we've covered the downsides of being a victim, let's look at the benefits. It makes sense that people would give victims not just the benefit of the doubt, but often benefits for their suffering. So do victims actually gain anything for their troubles? A study from Armour and Zaber 2020 examined applications for Social Security disability insurance or supplemental security income after a policy change that allowed for these programs to dissolve college debt, and found a suspicious increase in the number of victims with various disorders applying for government assistance, who also, for some reason, happen to have a huge amount of student debt. They found that the probability of applying for SSDI or SSI in a given quarter among student loan holders increased by 50% following the policy change, even though few of the applicants were actually eligible for student loan discharge. So yes, as I think we all kind of know, people will play the victim if they have something to gain by the act, but we always have to back up things that seem so obvious with data. Further evidence supporting the idea that victims may benefit from their status comes from Zagefka et al. 2010. Who examined trends in donating to victims of various disasters in a series of studies based on the degree of blame placed on the recipients of financial aid. In a first study, participants read about a tropical island facing famine after the destruction of a dam, either due to natural causes or due to shoddy workmanship, and were asked if they would donate to help. people were more willing to donate to islanders when they believed the cause was natural rather than man-made. A second study provided participants with a different example, this time asking if participants would like to donate to aid victims of a tsunami or the ongoing civil war in Darfur. When participants thought the victims were more to blame for their plight for engaging in civil war, they thought those victims should help themselves and were less willing to donate money compared to victims of a tsunami. A third study upped the stakes, this time not just asking people if they were willing to donate, but measuring if people would put their money where their mouth is. This time, participants read about a famine that had either been caused by extremely dry weather or by an ongoing civil conflict. Participants were given £3 for their participation in an envelope attached to the back of their questionnaire, as well as an additional envelope labeled for donations, which actually was given to charity. They didn't just put it back in the researchers' pockets. They found that people really were willing to back up their talk with cash, donating more money by an average of £2 to the famine caused by weather rather than the one caused by civil war. The final study in this set prompted participants with a story about an African village that had recently been attacked by a rebel group, which the village had either previously supported or refused support. Some were told the villagers were diligently working at rebuilding, while others read that the villagers had done nothing to improve their status. As in the third experiment, participants were given £3 to donate to the village, and they found that once again, people donated more to the villagers, over £1.5 on average, when they believed that they were uninvolved in the conflict, but not more when they believed the villagers were working at repairing the harm done. The takeaway from these studies is that people are more than willing to help victims, giving up their own money to do so, but they kind of want those victims to have played no role in their victimization. When victims have done something to have somehow brought suffering onto themselves, people just aren't as generous.
I can't defend everything I did back in junior high. I mean, who can? But let's face it, when you show up at school wearing a tweed blazer with elbow patches and carrying a valise, I think the guilt here is 50-50.
Not only are people willing to give to victims though, victimization itself can lead to selfish behavior, as seen in Zitek et al. 2010. In the first of 3 studies, participants were asked to write about a time that they had been wronged, or a time that they had been bored, and then completed an instrument that measured entitlement. Participants were then asked if he or she would like to help the researcher with an additional task, but for no additional pay. Those who thought about a time when they were treated unfairly were more entitled and were less likely to help the researcher pro bono. Similar results were forwarded in a second study. Once again, participants wrote about a time when they were either wronged or bored, and entitlement was measured as before, along with self-reported selfish behavior. But this time, selfishness was manifestly monitored by an inconspicuous jar of candy labeled for participants, with 2 empty wrappers left on the desk. Just goes to show, never assume anything in a study is there on accident. Researchers are watching you.
I am watching you pee!
As here are the number of candies taken, the amount of trash left, and other selfish behaviors like stealing the researcher's pen were all counted as selfish actions. Those who wrote about a time when they were wronged reported higher levels of both selfishness and higher entitlement predicted greater selfishness. Those who wrote about being wronged did not eat more candy, but they did engage in more selfish behaviors, with 5 leaving their trash on the table, 5 taking the experimenter's pen, and 1 knocking down a small sign on the table. In the last study in this battery, participants completed a computer-based letter-finding task, instructed that if they completed the task in the allotted time, they would receive $3 extra. The test resulted in a loss no matter what, with the unfair loss condition involving a large letter matrix that was missing a letter, and the unfair condition where the matrix was small but participants could not click on a letter due to an apparent error. Their entitlement, anger, and frustration were measured, and they were asked if they had an opportunity to participate again, competing against another person in the letter-finding task, how much money they thought they should get if the 2 applicants had to split $6. And they imagined that they had performed faster than 70% of participants. These are a really fun series of experiments, but this is kind of a pet peeve. Zitek et al., my dudes, my buddies, my ladies and gents. Why would you ask participants to imagine that they performed more competently when you could just lie and say they did? Whatever. The manipulation worked. They found that those assigned to the unfair loss condition, where the program froze, believed that they should get more money on a future task, with an average of $3.93 out of $6. As before, in addition to being more frustrated when the experiment had been unfair, those in the unfair loss condition were generally more entitled. This series of experiments illustrated that being a victim may often make people behave more selfishly, believing that they are due recompense not just for their suffering, but for minor inconveniences.
May I remind you, I'm a bit of a victim myself. As just yesterday I was punched in the face by a man now dead.
Because everyone wants to be a victim, and because groups often compete for victim status, oftentimes one group may dehumanize another to decrease the perception of others as true victims, rather than the self, as seen in Castano and Jenner Sorolla 2006. The researchers specifically were looking at infrahumanization, a term that refers to the denial of some of the characteristics that make us human, rendering the target as less than human. The first study contrasted humans to a fictional alien species, the Gs, who were working together with humanity on a mining project on the moon. When the humans were away for Christmas, one of two things happened. Either there was a massive mining accident, which was the fault of the humans, or the Gs, or there was an attack from humans, which both killed 10,000 Gs. When participants believed their shared in-group was responsible for the death of Gs, they were also more likely to see the Gs as less human. Infrahumanization, then, decreases the humanness of a group when that group is harmed by the in-group. A second experiment sought to ground the first in real-world intergroup interaction, and had participants read a vignette that described the decline in Australian Aboriginal people's population following the British arrival in Australia as due to either British spreading disease or a trend unrelated to British colonialism. British participants in this study were then asked how much emotion they thought Aboriginal people felt and how guilty their respondents felt for the consequences on Aboriginal people as a result of the British arrival in Australia. Participants were also asked how much they identified with being British and how much, if any, reparations were due to Aboriginal people. They found that as ratings of Aboriginal people's humanity increased, fewer human emotions were attributed to them. People who read that the British had a significant impact on Aboriginal people felt more guilt than those who read that the British had little impact. The more complex and human an emotion was seen as, the less it was attributed to Aboriginal people. In addition to guilt, impact also affected compensation, with participants in the high-impact condition being more willing to provide collective compensation than participants in the low-impact condition. For those who strongly identified as British, in the high-impact but not the low-impact condition, the more positive the emotion was, the less it was attributed to Aboriginal people. Thus, the more people think that their group may be responsible for victimizing others, the less human they may come to see that group as a response to feelings of guilt. A third study replicated the second, but instead examined the relationship between white Americans and Native Americans. This time attributing the decrease in Native population either to attacks by white Americans or to the diseases they brought with them, or said that white Americans had little impact on the decreased population of Native Americans. They found, as before, lesser attribution of emotion occurred as the humanity of emotion increased, but such a trend was stronger in the high-impact killing condition than in the low-impact condition or the high-impact disease condition. Participants who were told that white people had intentionally harmed Native Americans felt more guilt than those who read that the cause of their harm was disease or when they read that white people were not responsible. Similarly to the second study, high levels of identification as American led to decreased willingness to provide reparations to Native Americans. Those who strongly identified as Americans also felt less guilt for the past actions of white Americans towards natives than did low identifiers. This indicates that making people feel guilty doesn't necessarily make those people more willing to agree to pay restitution for the actions of their ancestors, and ultimately, those being guilt-tripped will instead tend to dehumanize the group claiming victimization. Once again, everyone wants to be the victim and no one wants to be the perpetrator. And when people are made out to feel like perpetrators, they don't react kindly, tending to infrahumanize the group that they are accused of harming, which does little to help either side. Today, with so many people claiming to be victims, what happens when those victims point to, as they so often do, another group to blame for their suffering? Well, as it turns out, when there's benefits to being a victim, as we've seen that there are, suffering begets suffering, as seen in data from Taylor Phillips and Lowry 2015, in their analysis of that evil of evils, white privilege.
Oh no! The race war starts now!
Participants read the following prompt. In the last half of the century, Americans have given considerable attention to matters of racial inequality. Despite increased attention to the issue, most social scientists agree that even today, white Americans enjoy many privileges that black Americans do not. White Americans are advantaged in the domains of academics, housing, healthcare, jobs, and more compared to black Americans. Participants' beliefs in white privilege and the reported amounts of life hardships were measured. White people who had been exposed to the prompt that claimed the existence of white privilege were more likely to claim personal hardships in their lives than did those who were not exposed to the white privilege prompt. A second study replicated the first, but this time also included a measure of affirmative action support, asking participants that if two applicants are equally qualified, one black and one white, if the black person should receive preferential treatment. This study also asked participants to select which, from a list of social values, they held to the highest consideration, such as family and friends. Once again, those exposed to evidence of privilege claim to have more life hardships than those not exposed. The effect of thinking about social values played a major role in the relationship between the privilege prompt and reports of life hardships, in that whites no longer responded to evidence of privilege by claiming more life hardships. In contrast, thinking about social values reversed this effect, leading whites to claim fewer life hardships when exposed to evidence of privilege. Additionally, denials of personal privilege were in turn associated with diminished support for affirmative action policies. These data are illustrative then that people don't like being told that they're privileged and will see themselves as victims when you do it. White people may be less likely to see themselves as victims when they're thinking about their morals, but overall, people do kind of want to be victims, not victors. And given all that we've looked at today, is it any surprise that people want to be seen as the victims when that status comes with status of its own? Being a victim not only may provide resources or elevated status to those who claim it, it may also absolve the alleged victim of blame for their actions, as seen in Gray and Wegner 2011. In their first experiment, participants read a story about George who gets paid $600 a week, and each week George was either a hero, giving $100 to charity, or a victim, wherein his boss steals $100 a week from his paycheck. They then read that George sees a woman drop $10 on the ground, picks it up, and keeps it for himself. Respondents viewed George as less to blame for the act of theft when he had previously been described as neutral or as a hero rather than as a victim. They also viewed victim George as having less agency than in the other two conditions, seeing him as having more influence over his actions when he wasn't a victim. The second study described Jeffrey, or Michael, who was described as a hero for starting a charity organization in college, or as a victim, being hit by a car in college and having since recovered, or as a neutral actor working in a hardware store. The characters were then said to be nearly responsible for a woman's death after serving her peanuts in a salad, despite being told to hold these nuts, the nuts. The former hero was seen as more to blame for the peanut incident than the neutral target or the victim. These results indicate that relative to an average person, victimhood helps escape blame while heroism hurts. A third experiment found that it's not just that people think victims are less to blame for negative actions, but that they actually don't even recall negative things about victims very well. This time, participants read about Graham, who in the hero condition did charity work, in the victim condition had been hit by a car but since recovered, or neutrally worked in a hardware store. Further proof that people who run these experiments have never worked in a hardware store. But then again, neither have I. As in the first study, Graham pocketed $10 he saw a woman drop on the street. Participants were then asked to recall information about Graham. 68% recalled the money theft when Graham was described as a hero, compared to only 42% who remembered his misdeed when he was described as a victim. As such, once again, victimhood is effective at escaping blame while heroism is ineffective. Not only do people see victims as less to blame, they may also see them as more virtuous. Thus, victim signaling is often really virtue signaling, as a study from Auck et al. 2020 illustrated across 3 studies. In their first study, participants read about David, a man who had been shot and paralyzed after volunteering for a charity, the virtuous victim condition, shopping at the store, the neutral victim condition, or visiting a strip club, the non-virtuous victim condition.
You kind of look like a stripper.
Mom? A high-end stripper. For governors or athletes.
Participants were then asked if they would donate money to help David if they had an extra $100, and found that people were only willing to donate when David was described as a virtuous victim. In a second experiment, participants were exposed to a GoFundMe for Jessie, who was asking for money to finish her hairstylist certification to become financially independent. Jessie was described in 3 ways: as a strong victim with no virtue signal coming from a background with an abusive mother and abusive ex, as a weak victim with a strong virtue signal, with Jessie depicted as a volunteer at a senior center who wants to give free haircuts to the residents of women's shelters, or with no such description. Participants were most willing to help Jessie when she was a strong victim with a strong virtue signal. An additional experiment in the second set concerned who was likely to virtue signal. This time, participants answered questions about their perceptions of self-victimhood and their tendency to virtue signal, such as purchasing products that they associate with morality.
Yes, and it's the choice of a new generation.
Participants' levels of each of the dark triad personality traits, that is Machiavellianism, which is a tendency to exploit others, narcissism, which is the expectation of special treatment from others, and psychopathy, which is a tendency to be callous or insensitive, were measured. All 3 dark triad traits positively predicted virtuous victim signaling, with Machiavellianism as the strongest predictor. This was so regardless of demographic variables that might make one less likely to feel like a victim, such as gender or minority status. A third study sought to find a link between victimhood and entitlement, which we've looked at before. this time by measuring willingness to purchase counterfeit sneakers. As before, victimhood was positively related to entitlement. Victimhood was also related both directly and indirectly through its relationship to dark personality traits to intentions to purchase counterfeit shoes compared to generic or brand name shoes. Virtuous victim signalers also believed that counterfeit producers were more moral than those low in the trait, likely convincing themselves that it's not morally wrong to save money by buying counterfeit products. Given that people are more likely to give to virtuous victims, and virtuous victims likely think it's okay to save money by purchasing counterfeit items, it's not surprising then that a fourth study found virtuous victim signaling was related to duplicitous actions designed to acquire resources. In this experiment, participants played a virtual coin flip game for a chance to win $1, guessing heads or tails. But regardless of which one was picked, participants always lost. Then an apparent glitch in the program allowed players to guess again twice, but they had been instructed to click skip question if that had happened. Participants had an opportunity to be honest and tell researchers that the game had glitched, and were asked questions about their honesty and humility. Those who were high in victim and virtue signaling were less honest and expressed less humility. High victim and virtue signalers were more likely to have flipped the coin again rather than skipping the question, as instructed, and were more likely to lie to the researchers about losing the first coin flip when directly questioned. These results indicate that people who think they are virtuous victims are more likely to cheat to get what they want. A fifth study examined virtuous victimhood in relationship with communal narcissism, a desire to shine on the stage, as well as fantasy proneness, that is a tendency to confabulation or exaggeration. Virtuous victim signaling was significantly and positively associated with communal narcissism and fantasy proneness, meaning that people who see themselves as victims are likely to engage in acting behaviors and duplicity to get what they want. Tying this back to our topic, this all makes a lot of sense. People who see themselves as innocent victims also see themselves as deserving of special treatment. That means they can excuse themselves for their immoral behavior. Additionally, not only will virtuous victims lie and cheat to get what they want, because they see themselves as victims, that means they see those around them as perpetrators, as was indicated in a final experiment. Participants read a prompt about a coworker, saying they suspected that coworker was talking some shit behind his or her back.
You wanna talk some shit? Call me.
However, they had no proof of this behavior, and the coworker was friendly to their face. Respondents were then asked to give a performance report on their coworker, wherein they could select several options, such as saying the coworker made demeaning or derogatory remarks to them, which had not happened according to the prompt. Virtuous victimhood was related positively to feelings of discrimination and exaggerated reports about the actions of the coworker. Not only will people who see themselves as victims feel they are entitled to compensation and special treatment for which they are allowed to lie and cheat to obtain, they are also more likely to confabulate about other people in order to find more reasons to feel like a victim. Now that we've seen that victims often benefit from being victims, and may go to seemingly any means to continue to benefit from being a victim, let's come to some conclusions. Today we looked at victimhood in a variety of contexts and scenarios, to understand why it is that so many people seemingly want to be victims. Victims compete with other victims to prove who is truly the most oppressed, and may be among the most likely people to not #believe all women, if that means that someone else gets a bigger piece of a victim resource pie than themselves. We saw that victims, particularly perpetual victims, see the world differently from the non-perpetually victimized, and that this perception gap causes them to see instances of mistreatment everywhere, giving these people continual reasons to feel sorry for themselves. While victim blaming is a real thing that exists, often based on the degree to which a victim is seen as agentic, we also saw that oftentimes victims will be the most likely to not believe other alleged victims, precisely because of victimhood's competitive nature. Finally, we saw that there are real benefits to being a victim, be that being more likely to apply for government assistance, to receiving donations from others, to being more willing to act immorally and excuse duplicitous behavior simply because one is a victim. Really, it seems that being a victim has far more benefits than it does negatives, hence why people so often compete for victimhood. But what do you guys think? Do you think that people often play the victim because they know it can lead to rewards, be they monetary or social? Are people who always seem to be victims intentionally manipulative to others, and do they use that victimhood for their own gain? Have you ever experienced another person competing with you in times when you really were victimized? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. As always, a massive thank you to all of my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar. You guys are awesome and really allow me to continue to make these videos, particularly on spicier topics like this one. If you want to help the channel, links to support are down below, as well as my merch store and a link for Surfshark VPN. Thank you all so much for watching this long video, and as always, dear friends, all ton of volts.